Welcome to East Asia Pulse, a podcast series by the East Asian Institute at the National University of Singapore. I'm Sarah Tong, and I'll be your host today. For this episode of the podcast, our guest is Dr. Su Qingyi of the Institute of World Economics and Politics of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing, where he is a senior fellow and director of its Department for International Trade. Dr. Su's research focuses on trade theory and policies, such as global value chains, free trade agreements, and China-US trade relations. Trump's reciprocal tariffs on imports from all countries not subject to separate sanctions imposed since early April this year have emerged as perhaps the biggest and most important issue in global trade. Dr. Su has rich expertise in trade-related research, including China-US economic relations. Today is a great opportunity to delve into some of these issues, especially from a Chinese perspective. Welcome, Qingyi, and thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm glad to be here.
We are speaking on 29th August 2025, just as the United States and China have agreed to extend their tariff truce for another 90 days through 11 November. And only 2 days after Washington imposed 50% tariffs on India goods over its continued purchases of Russia's oil, which is 27th August. Economic relations between the world's two largest economies have faced mounting challenges in recent years, with distrust continuing to deepen. Since the start of Trump's second term, the implementation of reciprocal tariffs has triggered a new wave of policy disruption that may further reshape the global landscape on interregional and intra-regional economic activities. In this context, I would like to begin by exploring the similarities and differences in trade policies under Trump's 2.0 compared with his previous administration. In a recent article, which you and your co-author look at the logic of Trump 2.0, you highlighted the several key characteristics of this recent one. So could you share with our audience what are the key differences and the rationale informing these important changes?
Overall speaking, I think Trump 1.0 and 2.0 have common features. That is protectionism and anti-globalization. I think they have the common feature. Of course, there are differences. The differences, I think, is for the level of protectionism is different, such as the 2.0, comparing with the 1.0, the 2.0 is much more extreme and aggressive. Specifically, as you have said, there are 4 points. The first is that for this term, Trump's action are moving faster. In his first term, after 1 year, he has some actions, such as on the 301 investigation. But this time, when he took office, he just moved and act. The second is that the range are more broader, because there are so many economies, so many industries imposed tariffs by Trump administration. And the third, I think, is much more clear. That means the Trump administration has issued some agendas, such as for America First trade policy agenda and American First investment. Of course, there are also Project 2025. So it's much more systematic, I think. It has agenda. The fourth, I think, is much more controversial. That means we know that he has transferred or changed his base. In his first term, mainly use 301, 232 investigation. But this time, he also impose tariffs much more conveniently. He used IEPA, that is International Emergency Economic Powers Act. So this has much more power to impose tariffs quickly and faster. And as for the goal of Trump administration, I think in his first term, he mainly emphasized creating jobs or have much more employment. Of course, security is very important, but it's not so important as this term because, in 2020, there's COVID-19. I think this COVID is very important that this makes the US government realize that the economic security is very important. That means during the COVID-19, the US depend so many medical products on China. The US government think in order to depend less on China, it should do much more. So this means the policy is much more extreme in this term. Of course, in order to realize this aim or goal, the US team think they should change the current trading system or economic order because they think the current trade system or economic order has lead to the US made them hurt. I think that is grievance doctrine. The concept is put forward by economist Richard Baldwin. That means the US is a victim of the current system. So how to change the current system? Because the WTO reform is very difficult and is very slow. So the US cannot wait for the reform of the WTO. So it think should utilize its power. That means impose reciprocal tariffs to push or force the other countries or economies to open their market to the United States. That means to reconstruct the current economic order by using tariffs. We know that the USTR of the United States, the Jameson Greer has mentioned it. I think it has an article in the New York Times. The article said that the US want to build a new economic order by using tariffs. So from the enforcement perspective, I think this time the Trump team has the same idea or philosophy with Trump. He just appointed the officials with the same idea or philosophy with him. But in his first term, maybe there are some officials has different opinions with Trump. So this means that for Trump 2.0, he can enforce his policy much more easily because there's no different voices.
Thank you very much. To follow up on the above, which of these changes that you highlighted are most disruptive or very damaging to global trade order and to the world economy?
It's difficult to see which change has more influence or impact on the world economy because the changes are interrelated. They are very related. I think the whole trade policy or policy all has big negative impact, such as I think there are mainly 4 impacts. The first is that it will impact the current trading system. It means change rules. The second is just hindering the economic globalization because it will disrupt the supply chains and have a big shock on the trade, especially on the goods trade. And third is that it will has a big shock on the global macroeconomy. That means it has some impact on the growth rate of the world. And the fourth is that I think it will change the production consumption model, especially in the Asia-Pacific regions. Such as we know that before the tariffs, China just make some final product and export to the United States. And also China import intermediate goods from Japan, from South Korea. But because of the tariffs, China's products are becoming very higher for the price. So for Vietnam, Malaysia, Mexico, they has opportunity to make some final product, just substitute China and export to the United States. But in the future, I think because so many countries imposed tariffs, maybe for the production structure, there will be some change. Another is that I think all economies have realized that their depend on the US market may be not a good choice. Of course, the US imports are very big. The ratio of its import in the world import, I think, is bigger than 13%. But I think for the other country, maybe export so much to the US. So I think for the world should find a new buyer. That means to depend less on the US market. As for the impact of different changes, for example, for the tariffs has a big shock on the global macroeconomy, but also it will has some negative impact on the current trading system, such as the tariff is based on unilaterally. It will destroy some principles of WTO, such as for the principle of most favored nations and for the binding tariffs. Because the US just imposed so many tariffs. All these changes, I think they will have a big shock on the rules on globalization, on macroeconomy, on the international division of labor. So there are so many impacts.
Thank you very much. So you have highlighted the very fundamental changes across the board for today world economy, trade rules, growth and division of labors, and so on. Let me move on to the next set of questions. So one of the characteristics of Trump's trade policy 2.0 is very broad scope in coverage in terms of geography, industry, and policy tools. What would you say about different countries' responses to this round of very broadly targeted policies by the Trump administration? We know so far that in the course of several months, a few economies have already reached sort of a trade deal with the United States, including United Kingdom, Japan, EU, Vietnam, and Indonesia. Although details of these deals are still not fully reviewed, what is your general impression and assessment of these deals? Also, to what extent do you think these deals are indicative of future negotiations? Maybe we start there.
First, I think the best choice of the other economies just united to retaliate the United States. Because there's a theory that for the optimal tariff theory, that means for big countries or big economy, it's better for them to impose some tariffs, better than free trade. But this has some premise. That means the other country doesn't retaliate. Of course, for the united retaliation, there's real difficulties because there's some dilemma for collective action. Some countries think maybe they just want to be free rider, waiting for the other country to retaliate. Of course, the other country just doesn't have some capacity to retaliate. They have no choice. So we can see that only China retaliate the reciprocal tariffs of the United States. So for Trump, I think he just wants to negotiate with the other countries one by one. So the other countries have to accept Trump's bargaining. For these deals, we know that there's really some economies has completed their negotiation with the United States. But for this deal, we should know that they are not real agreement as traditional agreement, such as for free trade agreements, and not agreement. They are just like terms of reference. There's just some pages. The words is not so many. So it's just some consensus or declaration between United States and the negotiation economies. So there are only a few deals just issued, such as for the UK-US deal and for a EU-US deal. There's only a few. And also is that the deals, I think there may be some controversy. The Trump explains some content, But for the other country, just explain another side, such as for the investment in the United States. The Trump think they have to, or they promise some investment in the United States. But for the other country, maybe they think it's just intention, not a very strong promise. From the content perspective, I think for the deal, they mainly include 4 parts. The first is that purchasing more U.S. goods, such as the agricultural goods, the oil, the energy products. And the second is that expand its own market to the U.S. That means lowering its tariffs when importing the U.S. goods. The third is that just increase their investment in the U.S. The fourth is accepting the U.S. tariffs. So I think the content mainly include the 4 parts. Of course, they are also related some national security applause. So that's the content. From the enforcement perspective, I think it's really difficult to enforce, actually. So for Trump, I think that's the deal he wants. Just try to make the U.S. manufacturing great again, to make some manufacturing reshoring. So that's what the U.S. government or Trump administration want to, just to have some world economic order that just serves the U.S. interest. So the other countries' interest should give the U.S. It's not friendshoring or nearshoring. I think that's a difference between Trump and the Biden administration. The Trump just wants reshoring, America first. So this, of course, will shock the current ruling system, just as I have said. For example, the other country lower tariffs of the United States, but the lowering tariff will not expand to the other countries. And another is that the other country have to admit the U.S. logic. That means using power to build order that serve the United States. This will shock the WTO rules system, such as maybe we can call it poison pill, that maybe for US and the other economies negotiation, there's some article that will hurt the China's benefit. For example, the US just try to persuade the other country to deter China's investment. So that will hurt China's benefit. I think China, of course, oppose this article. Of course, China welcome the other country has some negotiation within states, but the result should not hurt China's benefit.
Thank you. You mentioned the characteristics or main features of this trade deals between U.S. and individual countries. Would you say that these deals are unilateral in the sense that U.S. have certain requests and then the other parties accept? In which case, if I say these individual deals, as much as we know, are adding additional destruction for what we call a global trade order, or the ones we were pursuing for the world to have a standard, most unified, that means you treat everyone the same. So that would be something that had to bear additional damage from these deals. That means the deals are not helping to improve global trade or trade standards because they're very individualized, they're very American exceptionist, and doesn't do any help to multilateral trade and trading rules. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with the point, because the negotiation result is inconsistent with the WTO rules, because the other country promised to lower tariffs when importing U.S. products, but they will not lower tariff to the other economies. So this violates the MFN principles, the most favored nations principle. This will destroy the WTO principles. Of course, for this deal, it's not fair, because we know that in WTO we usually just negotiate. Even when we negotiate some free trade agreement, we want to negotiate with fair result. All partners, all parties should benefit from this result. But for the U.S. deal with the other economies, they just have to accept the U.S. bargain or what the U.S. want. They have to meet the requirement of the United States. But for the other economies, I think they just get very few or even get nothing from the deals.
Thank you. Let's move on to the more China-relevant questions. So amid the current round of trade talks and in response to Trump 2.0, China and its response remain quite significant given its role in international trade and global supply chain. So what is China's position and response to Trump's reciprocal trade policies so far? And what do you think is China's view of the varying responses to Trump's policies by its trading partners, especially its major trading partners such as Japan and Vietnam in Southeast Asia?
I think for China, China's position is very clear. That is, China don't want tariff war with any country. Always hope solve their trade disputes by negotiation. But China also are not afraid of tariff war, should maintain its benefit or interest. We know that the U.S. impose reciprocal tariffs on China. China retaliated quickly, very quickly. When Trump administration want to negotiate with China, China also accept the invitation of the negotiation. So we can see that there are 3 rounds of negotiation between the trade team of China and the United States. And of course, the result, I think, is relatively good for now. And for the other countries' negotiation with the United States, I think China respect the other countries' negotiation. But just as I have said that the negotiation result should not hurt the third party's benefit, or such as for China, that's China's position on the negotiation between United States and the other countries.
So as you said that unlike other countries, China has made very clear and prompt responses to the U.S. Trump 2.0. So what do you think are the most challenging or threatening issues that faced by China under current, although it's ongoing and changing? So how different is the responses this time compared to the ones in the past, either to Trump 1.0 or during the Biden time? So what's the key differences in the recent round of interactions in terms of China's trade policies reacting to the U.S.?
I think for different U.S. administration, they have consensus or they are the same China policy. We know that the U.S. has seen China as their only strategic competitor for the United States. Different president or different administration, at some perspective, they have same China policy, that is, try to contain China and push for some decoupling. Of course, there are some differences on the level of decoupling. Maybe for some administration, try to have complete decoupling. But for some administration, maybe they're just partial or targeted decoupling. I think that's the same feature or different feature. For me, I think from the Trump 1.0, China is gradually adjusting for the U.S. pressure or decoupling. So just make some preparation for this decoupling. China's capacity, its own capacity, is also rising. For example, some innovation in high-tech products, such as for high-end chips, and try to depend less on the U.S. high-tech products. Because you know that the U.S. government tried to force its companies not sell high-end chips to China. So China have to make some self-innovation. So during this process, I think the capacity or the power between China and the U.S. has been much more and more menacing. That means China also has much more capacity to retaliate for the United States. Another side is that I think for the trade side, China exports a lot to the United States market. But because the Trump 1.0 tariffs, actually for some Chinese company has quitted the US market and tried to sell products in China's own domestic market or sell to the other market. For these companies, if the companies are still exporting to the US market, that means they have much more bargaining power. That means they can let the US to eat the tariffs. So for China, I think one side is that its innovation capacity is rising. Another is that it's just during the process, it's preparing very well for the decoupling of the US policy.
Thank you very much for that. I have another question. As China's footprint in global trade increases continuously, are there additional efforts or steps to enhance China's role in global institutions and rulemaking, such as the WTO? Their thinking and steps and efforts. Thank you.
First, I want to say that actually for China's economic development in these recent decades, it has benefited from the current system. It's really hard, I think, for developing countries to make its economy growing fast because the current system is mainly designed by US, by Western countries. So for developing countries, they really face so much constraint among the current system. That's the first point. But China has utilized the current system. It's not easy, I think. The second is that, of course, so China wants to maintain or support the current system, including WTO. So just try to work together with the other WTO members to make some WTO reform, because we know that WTO really need to improve in some aspects. The third is that China will make some jobs or work in the global trade governance, and of course will according its capacity. So China also put forward some suggestions or some reform agenda to the WTO. In the future, I think in the global trade governance, China's role will be bigger and bigger.
Thank you. Maybe this is my last question. Speaking from Singapore, a member state of ASEAN, this is a question that is also a very big question from my heart. How do you see the future of China-ASEAN economic relations? China is obviously very important for ASEAN, and the US is also a very big trading partner for ASEAN. What do you see this China-ASEAN interactions economically going forward?
I always think that comparing with the North America, the Western Europe, or East Asia region and Southeast Asia regions are the most dynamic and potential area in supply chains, in economic development, because we have different economies with different economic level. That means you can have some economies made some labor-intensive manufacturing sector and have some countries high-end industries and some economies modern services sector. I think China and ASEAN are neighbors. Both take economic development as its very important aim. So that's China and ASEAN countries' common interest. So in this region, we have free trade agreement, such as for RCEP, and for China and ASEAN also has FTAs. I think for China and ASEAN should strengthen their economic and trade cooperation. So it has a large potential in the future. And China think ASEAN countries' priority in China's foreign policy and economic and trade relations. So for ASEAN countries, they are really different countries with different economic levels. For the production side, we can see that for Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam, they have great potential on developing manufacturing sectors. For ASEAN countries, I think they should grasp their opportunities during their process of development. And for Singapore, I think we know that Singapore is a very highly open economy. So Singapore will also benefit from this process. And the second is that I think for China and ASEAN countries should lead their economic integration in Asia-Pacific regions. So we can upgrade the RCEP because the rules are still has some gap comparing with the CPTPP. Of course, during this process, China also should expand its import. Just I have said that we should find a new buyer. So China has realized it and tried to expand its domestic demand and try to increase its import from the other countries. So we have Shanghai import-export in these recent years. So during this process, maybe the China-ASEAN countries should depend less on US market and has a very inner regional circulation. Just in this region, the countries can produce itself and can consume itself. So that's a very big picture I have seen.
Thank you very much. This has been a very insightful and useful discussion. I have myself learned quite a bit from this. So we basically, if I may, to put together some key takeaways from my perspective is number one, the Trump 2.0 reciprocal tariffs in particular has very deep and fundamental changes or maybe disruptions to the globalization, to trade rules and standards. So this, as you mentioned, there are several very key differences from what we've seen in the past. Second, there are very varied responses from countries. What we have seen so far is more unilateral-based kind of trade deals, and China has been one of the exceptions in terms of reacting to Trump's tariffs. But I think going forward, we also see there's still potential for countries to work together, whether it's having a more effective global rules or China is going to play a role in enhancing that globalization. And more importantly, last point is that China-ASEAN or East Asia in general, it's going to be difficult to have a concerted efforts, but that's something really necessary for the world to move forward, both in growth, in globalization, and in cooperation. So with that, I would like to thank Dr. Su Qingyi for joining us. Once again, I'm Sarah Tong at the East Asian Institute of the National University of Singapore, and you have been listening to East Asia Pulse. To learn more about our work and stay connected, you can subscribe to the EAI mailing list on our website or follow up on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. Thanks for listening to us, and until the next time, goodbye.